the spinal nerve? Both. Motor and sensory passes through the spinal nerve. What's a ramus?
It is after it's been mixed.
Yep. Okay, neuronal circuits. We talked about diverging, converging, and reverberating. You should be able to identify those. That is on page 363. You should know what a diverging, a converging, and a reverberating circuit are.
What did you say about the reflexes? I didn't take right.
You should be able to describe a reflex arc. In other words, it's stimulus and
The two kinds.
monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes.
You need to be able to
Just know what they are?
write out what they
No,
are.
no, 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 no. Well, I mean, yeah, you should know that like a monosynaptic reflex is literally sensory neuron, motor neuron. Polysynaptic is sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. But we also need to include stimulus, sensation, integration, motor output, effector muscle or gland. That's the reflex arc. Right? You can see the reflex arc right there on page 361. It tells you receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. There's a reflex arc. Okay, over on page.
Do you want us to be able to draw the circuits?
I'm sorry,
Would you like us to be able to draw the circuit?
there's no reason you shouldn't be able to. And on 362, incidentally, is the monosynaptic and polysynaptic you were asking about. Nerve regeneration. Can we regenerate nerves? Yes and no. We can regenerate axons, we cannot regenerate cell bodies. So take a look on 367. It tells you how we regenerate axons.
What page?
367. Chapter 13. The spinal
You need to know
cord.
that process on 367.
Yeah, figure 12, 15. Regeneration of an axon. Take a look at the regeneration of an axon. All right, looking on page 374. And again, there's going to be crossover here. More than likely, this stuff will be on the lab, but let's make sure we at least know what it is here too. The spinal cord. We describe the conus medullaris and the phylum terminale and the cauda equina and the cervical and lumbar enlargements. When we were talking about the spinal cord, we had the different funiculi, right? Dorsal, ventral, and lateral funiculi. We had the dorsal, ventral, and lateral horns. We had the central canal. We had ascending tracts, and we had descending tracts. We had the dorsal root. We had the dorsal root ganglion. We had the ventral root. We have the spinal nerves. You should know how many spinal nerves there are and how many of each type. So how many are on top?
8.
There are 8 cervical. Then how many?
12.
12 thoracic. Then 5 sacral, 5 lumbar, 1 coccygeal. 31 altogether. I agree with you. You should know what a ramus is. We had dorsal and ventral rami.
What did you say about enlargements in
The cervical and lumbar enlargements, that's basically where you see the plexuses branch off. We're going to talk about the plexuses in a minute. But the cervical and lumbar enlargements are where you see the different plexuses branching off.
So we need to know where they are? or-
Yeah. If you want to see a picture of them, they are on page 375. Cervical enlargement, lumbar enlargement. We talked about the great commissure. That's also with the spinal cord. We talked about the rootlets. That's also with the spinal cord. We talked about the 3 layers of connective tissue around it. The motors. The meninges. The 3 meninges. Dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. We talked about denticulate ligaments.
I think I missed that part, because I don't know what you're talking about.
And you mentioned it last time.
They hold together the spinal cord.
Yes, they do. They are extensions of the pia mater. I said they were very like Sharpie's fibers. When you've got periosteum around bone, you know how the Sharpie's fibers go into the bone matrix? In the same way, denticulate ligaments help to hold the spinal cord in place in the vertebral column. They're extensions of the pia mater. You'll find it there in your book. Which of those maters, which of the meninges is vascular? The arachnoid mater is vascular. I would agree, that's where the blood vessels are. What is the subarachnoid space? You're right, that's where you do your lumbar puncture. That is also the pathway for cerebrospinal fluid. Subarachnoid space is where most of that cerebrospinal fluid is located, at least around the spinal cord. On page 378, we see a diagram that describes the flow of information. It involves the somatic sensory and visceral sensory and motor sensory, visceral motor and somatic motor.
What page is this?
That is on page 378. You should be familiar with where that information is being processed or received. So I'm on page 378, there's a diagram there. It talks about the somatic motor and visceral motor and the somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Do you see it? The sensory is on the dorsal horn. The motor is on the lateral and ventral horns. We did talk about a lumbar puncture. We also talked about the function of cerebrospinal fluid. Make sure you know the function of cerebrospinal fluid and what meningitis is.
Organization of spinal fluid?
I'm sorry?
What did you say, organization?
The functions of spinal fluid, of cerebrospinal fluid. What are the functions of cerebrospinal fluid? It talks about on page 379.
What did you say before that?
Meninges, or meningitis.
Okay.
All right, page 379, we're starting to talk about the brain. I'm not going to do anything as far as the development of the brain. However, on page 381, it starts talking about the ventricles. You should know where the lateral ventricles are. They're also called the first and second ventricles. So we have the first and second ventricles, we have the third ventricle, and we have the fourth ventricle. What connects the third and fourth ventricles?
The aqueduct?
You're right, the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. What would I find inferior of the fourth ventricle? What's running down from it? Central canal. Very good.